Last time we spoke, Lin Zexu had brought the foreign barbarians to their knees, and Elliott was forced to hand over 20,000 chests of opium. Lin Zexu destroyed the illicit substance, ridding his nation of its filth. Elliott made a terrible error when he told the opium merchants the British government would compensate them for the confiscated contraband. This would all lead to Captain Henry Smith of the Village firing the first shot of the First Opium War. Britain was in a financial bind. They needed their tea fix, and China was closing off trade to them. How was Britain going to compensate the opium merchants and open up China to keep the tea flowing? It was at that moment Thomas Macaulay made the suggestion to Lord Palmerston, a rather out-of-the-box idea. Why not make China pay for it all? This episode is part 1 of the First Opium War. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just wanted to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, narrated by yours truly. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I happen to have a 45-minute episode on the First Opium War. So if you like visuals, why don't you check it out over there? They mean a lot to me. Lin Zexu's attempt to send a letter to Queen Victoria proved to be a failure. No one cared. But back in China, Lin Zexu's war against opium earned him a grand promotion. He went from High Commissioner to taking Deng Tingzhen's title as Governor General. This seems to have bolstered Lin Zexu's resolve to deal with the foreign barbarians, as he wrote at the time, "Only by knowing their strengths and their weaknesses can we find the right to restrain them." Lin Zexu shared his countrymen's contempt for the foreigners, but he knew he had to learn more about this enemy in order to defeat them. Lin Zexu was a scholar, and he had a practical mindset for how to go about the task. Lin Zexu began by buying the British warship Cambridge for the use of the Chinese Navy, and anchored it around the mouth of the Canton River. The only problem was that Elliott made sure to order all of Cambridge's cannons removed before it was sold to the Chinese sailors. And alongside that, the Chinese sailors were unable to properly sail the vessel, thus it literally had to get towed to the Canton River. By spring of 1840, there were just a few limited battles between the Chinese war junks and some British vessels, still attempting to smuggle opium into Canton. Elliott decided the first course of action was to map the Yangtze River so he could provide good intelligence to the incoming British force. He sent a ship from the Jardine Matheson Company called the Hellas. Unbeknownst to Elliott, Matheson told its captain, Frederick Jauncey, to try and sell opium while they navigated the Yangtze to hedge his profits. The Hellas ran into some trouble on May the 22nd of 1840 when Captain Jauncey ran into what he originally thought were just a few Chinese merchant ships, but were in fact 8 war junks. They opened fire on the Hellas and attempted to ram and board her, but Hellas was able to keep the firefight at a distance until some strong wind picked up, allowing Hellas to make an escape. Captain Jauncey earned a broken jaw and almost lost an eye during the battle, and a few of his crew were hurt, but there were no fatalities. By the end of May, the Hellas limped back to Macau for some medical treatment. And on June the 8th, a Chinese fleet of fire ships loaded to the brim with gunpowder were sent into the British ships anchored at Cap Sing Mum, some 45 miles east of Macau. Many of the British vessels fled for their lives, but the warships, Village, Druid, and Hyacinth, rushed forward to stop the fireship attack. They used grappling hooks to tie up the fireships from a distance and tow them away from the rest of the British flotilla, thus saving them all. I guess if anybody had a lot of experience with fireships, it would be the British. The next day, the long-awaited British force Palmerston promised finally arrived in Chinese waters. There was a scarcity of sailors hindering what could be amassed for the China Expeditionary Force, due to ongoing wars and other operations against the French in the Mediterranean Sea and the forces of Muhammad Ali in Egypt. By the end of June, 17 men of war had assembled, including 3 line of battleships, the Wellesley, the Melville, and the Blenheim. The East India Company also lent a hand, providing 4 armed merchantman steamers, the Enterprise, Madagascar, the Atalanta, and the Queen. Following behind the force was 27 troop ships carrying the 18th Royal Irish, the 49th Bengal Volunteers, the 26th Cameronians, a corps of Bengal engineers, and another corps of Madras sappers and miners. On its way to catch up to this force was Britain's most devastating weapon, a brand new ocean-going iron warship, the first of its kind, named Nemesis. She was launched in 1839 and deployed to China as her first operation. She was powered by 2 60-horsepower Forester engines and armed with 2 pivot-mounted 32-pounders and 6 6-pounder guns. She had watertight bulkheads, the first to be used for a warship at that time, enabling her to survive a ton of hull damage. It goes without saying, this one warship will have a daunting part to play in this story, and the Chinese would nickname her Devil Ship. The British Armada did not just bring military assistance, it also was secretly carrying more opium. Because, of course, why not? Over 10,000 chests were snuck aboard the ships ready to flood the Chinese market. The large British naval presence would allow the smugglers to offload their opium at Lintin during broad daylight with impunity. The Armada gathered itself at Singapore to devise a strategy going forward. There in Singapore, the Marines practiced amphibious assaults while Chinese warjugs in the distance observed from a distance. By June the 1st of 1840, enough warships had gathered at Singapore to launch the invasion of the Qing Dynasty. So on June the 16th, the first ship, a steamer named Madagascar, entered the Gulf of Canton, followed a bit later by a large part of the Armada. Aboard the Wellesley, Captain Elliott met with the commander of the Expeditionary Force, Commodore Sir J. Gordon Bremer, and they discussed strategy. Jardin had made a proposal to commit some warships to blockade the entire eastern and southern coasts of China and seize the island of Chusan. Jardin argued that they should also blockade the mouth of the Beihai River, which flowed into the Yangtze, the waterway for food and other shipments directly to Beijing. Chusan Island was a critical depot for the Qing. More than 250,000 tons of grain passed through it on its way to Beijing to feed the capital. Depriving the capital of a major food source and revenue would bring the Chinese to a peace settlement and thus a British victory. The British Admiralty's Sir John Barrow thought Jardin's proposal was too much. Threatening the Qing capital would just result in the Chinese digging in deeper to defend themselves and not bring them to the peace table. Barrow argued they should instead focus around the Gulf of Canton, shell the city, and seize Hong Kong. Charles Elliott argued a middle ground, take Canton, then sail up the Beihai River to threaten Beijing. Elliott also argued they could instead attack Shanghai, because attacking such a prominent city would make the Qing lose face and intimidate them. Another man who had just arrived was Elliott's cousin, Admiral Sir George Elliott, who had been given co-plenipotentiary powers. He brought with him a peace treaty with orders to make the Qing government agree to every article of it and to continue the way until it was done. Sir George Elliott arrived in the later part of 1840 and ordered a blockade of the Gulf of Canton using 5 warships, while he and the rest of the Armada sailed north. The British merchants were disappointed. They expected a direct assault upon Canton. They had hoped to open the city back up for trade. Both Elliots got aboard the Wellesley as the Armada made its approach towards Chusan. George Elliott also had with him a letter from Palmerston to inform the Emperor that Britain intended to blockade and seize various Chinese ports, as a response to the Qing siege of the Canton factories. Lord Palmerston also cheekily added that if the emperor wanted to stop the opium trade, he should probably convince his people to stop smoking opium. Kind of a dick move. At the end of the letter, Palmerston added that to avoid unpleasantness, the emperor was invited to send a delegation to a shipboard meeting with the two Elliots, who most likely would park their warships at the mouth of the Dinghai River. The Elliots gave the letter to a captain named Thomas Bourchier, whom went ashore with a white flag at Amoy, just 300 miles north of Canton. As Thomas entered the harbor, some Qing officials came aboard. Thomas explained to them that the Armada meant to bombard the city if they did not respect the white flag. As he explained this to them, along the coast a ton of Chinese began to form a crowd near his boat, so he sailed off. With his ship now a few hundred yards away from the shore, he waited to see what the Chinese would do. Then Thomas noticed cannons being mounted on a nearby fort. Thomas sent his translator, named Robert Thom, on a small raft with a large placard repeating what retaliation the Chinese could expect if they fired upon a ship. Thom also began to shout orders at the crowd along the beach, but they simply screamed insults in return. I am honestly trying to envision what this would have looked like. This poor guy in a raft with a placard screaming at all these people on the coast. This must have been hilarious. Well, it wouldn't have been too funny when some of the people on the beach began to swim out towards Thom's boat, and a few arrows and gunshots were fired at him. Suddenly, one of the cannons from the fort fired, and some nearby Chinese war junks joined them, all aiming for poor Thom. Thom dashed back to Captain Thomas and reported to him what had happened. Captain Thomas responded by sending another letter explaining that the British government had no quarrel with the Chinese people, only their emperor. He sent the letter with another courier in a small raft, and as it approached the shore, the mob rose up yet again and soon gunfire was going off. It is alleged after this, Captain Thomas literally threw a message in a bottle before sailing off towards Canton. Honestly, this entire situation is just so funny. By July the 1st, the Armada anchored in the harbor of Dinghai on Chusan Island. Dinghai held around 40,000 inhabitants within a 5-sided, 22-foot-tall high-walled city. It held many towers and was surrounded on all 4 sides by a canal. The city had 1,600 defenders, but in reality they were all just some fishermen, sailors, and quickly raised up militiamen armed with spears, bows, and a few matchlocks. There were also 12 Chinese war junks that had followed the British Armada, keeping a safe distance. The British noticed one of the Chinese war junks had a banner indicating a high Qing official was aboard, and they signaled they wanted to talk. The Chinese war junks invited a British delegation aboard their flagship. Commodore Bremer went aboard with his interpreter and he met with the Qing commander of the Chusan garrison. Bremer did not mash words, and he was quite blunt, demanding outright, "Surrender Chusan or face the consequences." The Qing host was not intimidated, however, and they sent the British back to their boats. When the British were back aboard their vessels, instead of blasting the Chinese war junks to pieces, well, they simply invited the Chinese aboard the Wellesley to wine and dine them. Now, just a bit of a side note here. There's a 1997 movie titled The Opium War, and they did this scene, and it's actually quite well done. I actually recommend watching it because it's pretty entertaining. The movie was a dual project between the Chinese government and the British, and they put a lot of effort into it. By no means is it a very good movie, mind you, and there's a big reason why you've probably never heard of it. I mean, it came out in 1997, and there was a heap load of better movies coming out that time, so that's pretty much what happened. But I'll just note here, I used a ton of clips from this movie for both my episodes on the First Opium War and the Second Opium War, and I did a historic film review of the film in question, similar to History Buffs if you've ever seen that YouTuber. So please, if you have a chance, check it out on my channel. Especially the historic film review, because if I can get some more views on some of those episodes, because I've done a few episodes in different films, I'll start doing some more, and I really enjoy doing that. And in a last-ditch effort to try and sell you on this film, The actor Bob Peck, you would probably recognize him as the hunter named Muldoon in the original Jurassic Park. Well, he plays a terrible opium merchant in the film, and he is very entertaining as it makes it seem like he causes the entire opium war by himself. Back to the story. The Qing officials dined, and one Qing officer even analyzed some of the 74 guns aboard the Wellesley. That very same officer was quoted to say, "It is true, you are strong, and I am weak. Still, I must fight." After dinner, Commodore Bremer demanded their surrender again, which was probably very awkward, and he gave them 24 hours to comply. The Chinese, in the meantime, ran ashore and began to stuff a ton of sandbags with rice and other things to try and strengthen the defenses around Dinghai's walls. The 24 hours passed, and Bremer brought the Wellesley closer to the shore, but he had to wait for some more reinforcements to arrive to launch an amphibious assault. By 2 p.m. on July the 5th, 6 British warships arrived to the scene, and Bremer fired a single cannon targeting a tower on the small fort. The Qing fired a single cannon in response, which led Bremer to start shooting volleys every 10 minutes. As the maelstrom was going on, Lieutenant Colonel George Burrell led the 18th Brigade in amphibious landing. Suddenly, the Chinese stopped firing just as the 18th Brigade landed ashore. The British took the situation by storm and began bombarding the Chinese war junks to pieces in Dinghai's fort towers. Lord Jocelyn, a military secretary, said of the scene, "The crashing of timber, falling houses, and groans of men resounded from the shore. Even after the bombardment ceased, a few shots were still heard from the unscathed junks. We landed on a deserted beach, a few dead bodies, bows and arrows, broken spears, and guns remained the sole occupants of the field." The 18th Brigade found no resistance on the beach. The Qing defenders had fled almost as soon as the first cannons had gone off. A Qing commander on the scene, named Brigadier Zhang, had refused to give up the fight, but had both of his legs blown off by a cannonade, and he had to be whisked away on a litter. The local magistrate and some of his subordinates watched in horror as the defenders departed, and they all committed suicide. A detachment of the 18th Brigade set up 8 9-pounder artillery pieces and some howitzers on a hill which had a vantage point overlooking the city of Dinghai. They then began to shell the now defenseless inhabitants, forcing countless to flee for their lives. The British reported not a single casualty during the volley exchange, nor the beach assault. Lord Jocelyn described the planting of the Union Jack by the Joss House in Dinghai. "The first European banner that has floated as conqueror over the flowery land." The city of Dinghai was a mile from the shoreline, and Colonel Burrell slowly marched his men to its formidable walls as artillery rained hell upon them. The residents of Dinghai responded with their own artillery, forcing Colonel Brunel to hold back his men from a distance and to wait it out until the next day to assault the city. During the lull, the British soldiers found some samshu in a local fishing village and proceeded to get drunk as hell, and looted the fishing village during the night. One Indian soldier said of this incident, "A more complete pillage could not have been conceived. The plunder ceased only when there was nothing to take or destroy." The artillery was going on throughout the night, and at around midnight, one of the British 9-pounders hit a gunpowder deposit inside Dinghai, turning the city into an inferno. The next morning, the British saw most of the defenders were fleeing, and sent a detachment of 12 men to approach the south wall to just prod it. There was no resistance, so the men began to climb the rice bag defenses that had been piled almost 2 stories high in front of the wall. Within minutes, they were over the top, and they could see the city that once held 40,000 people was all but deserted. Lord Jocelyn said of the city, "The main street was nearly deserted, except here and there, where the frightened people were performing the kowtow as we passed. On most of the houses were placards, saying, "Spare our lives." And on entering the joss houses, we saw men, women, and children on their knees, burning incense to the gods. And although protection was promised to them, their dread appeared in no matter relieved. The British reported that perhaps 2,000 Chinese had died, which is complete nonsense. The Chinese state like something around the figure of 25 died. So the actual number is somewhere in between, I would imagine. The British themselves might have lost up to 19 men. They found a ton of antiquated weapons and armor as they looted the city, such as padded cotton jackets, which displayed the disparity between the two forces. Robert Thom, who witnessed the looting, said, "No one has been killed in cold blood that I am aware of, and only 1 or 2 cases of rape occurred, perpetrated, it is said, by the sepoys." By the way, I am using a source that uses a ton of primary sources from British officers, and a lot of them, and I mean a lot of them, place the blame for any misconduct on Indian soldiers. Whether it be rape, plunder, pillaging, all that stuff. Of course, all of that did happen, but the fact that these British soldiers always come out clean, and it's always the Indian soldiers, I mean, take that with a grain of salt. Pretty sure there's guilty parties everywhere. The same thing goes for the casualties on the British side. The primary sources are absolutely ridiculous. They'll never admit to the British actually taking any casualties. By July the 11th, Jardin and Matheson reached Chusan and found out Admiral Elliott was forbidding their opium ships from landing on the island. Yet they pressed their team of smugglers to persist against Elliott's wishes to unload the opium. Chusan would become a storehouse for opium, and by November of 1840, 43 opium smuggling ships were using Chusan as an offloading point. 12,000 chests of opium would be brought to Chusan by the end of the year. Chusan Island would also bring quite a lot of misery to the British. Colonel Burrell refused to allow his troops to occupy the abandoned city of Dinghai, fearing repercussions from the Chinese, and instead kept his men in a particularly malaria-infested paddy field. With the scorching heat and an order that all the men keep their top buttons on their uniforms fastened, almost 500 men would die to malaria and dysentery. There are a lot of variables at work here. Bad provisions, too much samshu, stagnant water, and the most evil culprit, malaria-infested mosquitoes, which all took a heavy toll on the British. By October, only 2,036 out of the 3,650 troops would be fit for duty. By December, more than 5,000 men were admitted to hospitals, and 448 deaths would occur. If anyone knows the story of Japan's invasion of Taiwan in the 19th century, it really reminds me of that entire ordeal. Taking an island by force with incredible ease, only to fall victim to brutal Mother Nature. On July the 27th, Elliott had gathered many warships at Dinghai and felt he had enough firepower to proceed 500 miles north to Beijing. A week after Dinghai fell, Beijing got word. However, this is where a large problem would emerge for the Qing Dynasty. The emperor was given word through Qing officials, and if the news was bad, well, the officials would fear enraging the emperor, and more often than not, falsify what they told him. In this case, the officials downplayed the severity of the incursion. They told him of the alleged weaknesses of the foreign invaders. The governor of Jiangsu province, lying at the mouth of the Yangtze River, Yukin, told the emperor, "Take our fort at Wusong. From the bottom upward there is a stone base, then the clay base, and finally the fort itself. It is even elevation far above the level of the barbarian ships. If they shoot upward, their bullets will go down, and consequently lose force. Moreover, the barbarians are stiff and their legs straight. The latter, further bound with cloth, can scarcely stretch at will. Once fallen down, they cannot again stand up. It is fatal to fighting on land. Yukin would also make remarks about how the barbarians lacked bows and arrows. While this probably comes off as rather humorous to you, I bring it up for very important reasons. The emperor will continuously be given these sort of reports, downplaying such events as the battles, making up stories about victories over the British, and much, much more. The emperor will be reacting accordingly based on the information he is given, and this will be kind of the crux of the entire war. The British Armada approached the mouth of the Beijing River in the course of 10 days, and was only 75 miles southwest of Beijing. However, at the mouth of the Beijing River lied one of the Qing Dynasty's most formidable defenses, known as the Dagu. In English, we refer to them as the Dagu forts. 2 Dagu forts guarded the mouth, though to Elliott they looked pretty decrepit and deserted. Elliott was still trying to find a Qing official who would take Palmerston's letter to the emperor, and at the mouth he saw several Chinese war junks. Elliott sent a man with the letter to the war junks, and the commander of the warships replied that he would send the letter to a higher-ranking Qing official who was only a short distance away. Thus, Elliott waited to see what would occur, and it turned out that Qing official was Zishan, the governor of Jili province. Zishan sent word to Elliott that his letter was sent directly to the emperor, but that Elliott would need to wait for a reply. On May the 13th of 1840, one of Zishan's subordinates came aboard the Wellesley, providing the British with food and water, and this was followed up for several days with more gifts. Then Elliott was told the emperor had officially received the letter, but it would regretfully take another 10 days or so for the Qing court to discuss with the emperor the letter's contents. Do not forget the story I spoke about with the malaria and the dysentery outbreak on Chusan was raging by this point, and thus Elliott decided it best to scatter the armada in search of cleaner water, because the Chusan wells seemed to be the culprit at the time. Some of the ships went hundreds of miles away in search of water, and as all this occurred, 10 days had come and gone. When all of the armada regrouped with their fresh water reserves, Elliott decided they needed to speed up the Qing court process. Elliott ordered the warships Madagascar and Modesty to begin firing at some forts on the Chusan outskirts. But before the shelling could begin, a messenger from Zishan suddenly appeared. Elliott was invited to meet with Zishan in 3 days' time. The meeting would be on July 30th, and the location was a fort in southern Chusan. Zishan brought gifts and food with him for the British, and had a flotilla built up so that the British would not have to walk in mud to get to the fort. Elliott, Zishan, and Jocelyn had a large dinner, and then they discussed the Palmerston letter for over 6 hours. Zishan during the meeting made a mention of the precedent set by the Macartney and Amherst missions, that of the tributary system. Elliott insisted both men were not tributaries, but ambassadors holding equal status to the emperor. Zishan could feel the tension in the room, and he decided to change the subject. He pointed out the occupation of Chusan Island was unacceptable for the emperor. Elliott understood and said the British occupation was just temporary. They were merely using it as a base of operations. Then the largest looming subject emerged, that of opium. Zishan demanded a promise from Queen Victoria that Britain would stop exporting opium to China. Similar to Lin Zexu, the Qing had a difficult time understanding the representatives of authority for other nations, and they, simply assumed Queen Victoria held a similar position to their own emperor. Elliott said plainly that he did not have the authority to grant such a concession, and then made this remark. If the Chinese wanted the opium trade to end, they should stop using it. Elliott also made a remark that most of the opium was coming from other sources outside British influence, but he had little evidence to support this. Xishan swallowed this resentfully, but did not quibble over it. Instead, Xishan moved the subject to that of reparations, as Palmerston had demanded compensation for the 20,000 seized opium chests and for war reparations for Britain, who was invading China. Xishan flat out called these demands ludicrous. And as he began saying this, Elliott began to write something on Palmerston's letter. And when Xishan asked him what he was writing, Elliott replied this: "I am merely writing what your opinion is on the matter, because the Emperor and many of his officials might have differing ones." Xishan then began to explain to Elliott that Lin Zexu had fallen out of favor with the Qing court, and that Xishan agreed with the British that Lin Zexu had mistreated them and employed unnecessary violence. Xishan made a remark that the Emperor was most likely going to fire Lin Zexu and punish him. It seems Xishan was hinting to Elliott that he might be the guy replacing Lin Zexu as his successor, and with plenipotentiary powers. So you get the idea here. Xishan is basically hinting, while nothing can be done right now, perhaps when he is in charge, he will be able to help the British out. Xishan also kept stating that the British should go back to Canton, as it was the center of foreign trade and a much more logical and practical place for them to go on for further negotiations. But both Elliott and Xishan knew why he was stating this repeatedly. He wanted the British to get as far away from the Emperor as possible. George Elliott informed Charles Elliott that he felt the Armada was quite vulnerable sitting in the Beihhe Bay, and urged an end to the negotiations so they could leave. Likewise, upon hearing the news that Lin Zexu was going to be dismissed soon, Charles Elliott agreed that they too, and the Armada, should just sail away. This rather abrupt parti, however, gave the Chinese the impression the barbarians were done with the war altogether. And as you can imagine, many Qing officials began telling Beijing this. And as you can also imagine, the British departure was only temporary. By September of 1840, the British Armada re-emerged at the mouth of the Beihhe River. The Elliotts had ordered the Armada to up the pressure on the Qing, and Charles Elliott had written a note to Palmerston at this time. "It is notorious that the Dagu Emperor entertains the utmost dread of our enterprising spirit." What he meant by this was by sending periodic naval patrols, he was trying to scare the shit out of Beijing. Back over in Canton, despite the incredible efforts of Lin Zexu, the opium trade was still rearing its ugly head. Since Jardin and Matheson were now able to shove their contraband on Chusan Island, it began to flood right back into the Cantonese market. By the fall of 1840, 6,500 chests had gotten through the Canton trade from Jardin and Matheson Company alone. Many hundreds of others were flooding in from other independent smugglers, and despite the severity of punishment for using the substance, there was still an enormous demand. The Elliotts, of course, banned the trade of opium on Chusan, but they were not morons. They knew it was simply going to Canton in the end. Of course, they were allowing the trade to go on. They were, after all, pretty broke. The Elliotts had no other way of raising money to continue the war effort other than relying on the sale of opium. Both Elliotts understood the fiscal dependency they had on the opium smugglers, and the prohibition of its sale on the island of Chusan was merely symbolic, a way of keeping face. Very, and so typically British. Thus, vessels were allowed to offload opium near Chusan with zero interference from the British Armada, which in turn was patrolling the waters, thus protecting the opium dealers in the end. The hope in the end was by symbolically banning the substance at Chusan, perhaps this would alleviate the emperor while simultaneously allowing the revenue go to the war effort by allowing the trade to ports like Canton. Over in Beijing, Emperor Dagu hesitated over Lin Zexu. He was not yet comfortable dismissing him. This emboldened Lin Zexu, who began to crack down even more so on the Chinese opium consumers. Lin Zexu put out an edict limiting the amount of time opium addicts had to wean themselves off the drug. While the period is not yet closed, you are all living victims. When it shall have expired, then you will all be dead victims. Yet despite his efforts, Lin Zexu could do little against the opium vessels, which were being protected by the British Armada, making its patrols in the Gulf of Canton, Amoy, Chusan, and at the mouths of the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers. Then, to the horror of the Chinese, the British began seizing Chinese ships along the coast and taking their cargo to sell and finance the war effort. Imagine how cash-strapped a nation has to be to start performing this sort of looting, or I guess better said pirating. Between June and July of 1840, the British Armada had seized 7 large trading vessels plundering their cargo. In retaliation, the Chinese raised a price for the heads of any British military personnel at $100 for a soldier taken alive, $20 for a corpse, a whopping $5,000 for a British captain, and for a British ship, $10,000. Cha-ching. Things got out of hand quite quickly. Chinese, desperate to make some coin, turned to attacking European and American civilians such as missionaries. Gangs of Chinese would hunt them down, beating them nearly to death. On August the 5th, one Vincent Stanton, a tutor of British merchants' children, alongside another missionary named David Abel, made the terrible decision of going swimming in Macau's Bay. Stanton was kidnapped and brought to Canton. Until this point, Macau was seen as kind of the last safe spot in China for foreigners. But the kidnapping of Stanton broke all of that. Adding to everyone's fears, 8 Chinese war junks docked at Macau, sending the Portuguese colony into a frenzy. It turns out Stanton's kidnapping was masterminded by Lin Zexu, and it was psychological warfare. He was not able to go after the British warships, but he was able to target anybody on land. The Governor-General of Macau, Pinto, pleaded with Lin Zexu to return the man, but it came to nothing. The British felt they had lost face. Stanton was one of theirs, and they even tried allowing the Portuguese aid the situation, but it was to no avail. 2 weeks after Stanton's kidnapping, the British had had enough. 4 British warships from the Armada were sent to Macau's Casilia Bay, alongside 400 soldiers. The British warships opened fire on the Chinese war junks, who also tried to fire back. However, the Chinese war junks' cannons were old and obsolete. They could not match the range of the British firing upon them. The Chinese crews began to panic when their return fire was literally only matching half the distance of the British cannons, and soon many men were jumping ship. Meanwhile, the British warships simply continued to rain hell upon the war junks, as noted by one British officer. The Chinese war junks, which were aground in the inner harbor, were utterly useless, for none of their guns could be brought to bear, though several of the 32-pound shots of the ships found their way over the bank, much to the consternation of the occupants of the war junks in question. The Chinese crews tried to establish a defense on the coast, but the British soldiers overwhelmed them with musket fire. The Chinese war junks, still intact, made a break for it, as the rest of the Chinese fled into the fortifications. The British warships battered the walls of Macau's fortifications until their batteries stopped returning fire, and then the British and Indian soldiers soon scaled those walls. By 5 p.m., the Chinese routed inside the Macau fortifications, as the British set fire to multiple barracks. And in the end, the Chinese suffered up to 60 dead with 120 wounded, and the British, they only reported 4 wounded. But, like I said, take that number with a grain of salt. In Beijing, Qing officials told Emperor Dagu that there had been a major victory at Macau, and that many British were dead, and multiple British warships laid at the bottom of Casilia Bay. These Qing officials were court officials who were receiving false reports from military officers at Macau. Think of it this way, it's sort of like a game of broken telephone, where every link embellishes the story to make it more and more positive for the Qing. All the Chinese soldiers began to abandon Macau, and no more Chinese war junks came to its harbor. In the eyes of the Portuguese and British, they had saved Macau. In the eyes of poor Stanton, well, he was still imprisoned in Canton. The Stanton kidnapping distressed the foreign community in China, but there was another incident that scared the shit out of them. A French missionary named Father Jean-Gabriel Parois was illegally operating in Hubei province and got captured in September of 1839. He was tortured and interrogated for over a year, and on September the 11th of 1840, he was executed publicly at Wuchang. The priest was killed by strangulation, but the Qing authorities decided to place his body on a cross after his death. This set a panic into the foreign community as others were likewise captured and killed, and the British on Chusan Island were falling victim to malaria, dysentery, and starvation, because all the food on Chusan had dried up. They began to eat moldy rice from Chusan stockpiles, and bread made from worm-ridden flour stuck aboard their ships for quite a long time. That is pretty gross. It is also alleged the pickled beets and pork on the British warships were so rancid even the iron stomachs of the British could not tolerate it. And that's saying something. The drinking water likewise was a source of disease, contaminated by local sewers. The interpreter, Thom, wrote a letter to Matheson stating this: "Even the natives hold their noses because of the water's smell. Unless we can manage to get the canal and town cleared out, I fear that we shall be getting some contagious distemper amongst us. The climate, moreover, is moist and mosquitoes swarm in amazing numbers. Let no man come here without mosquito curtains, else he will bitterly repent it." The British did not realize the mosquitoes were the actual culprit of their malaria nightmare, as the belief at the time for the Europeans was that malaria came from rotten vegetables. The dysentery killed more people than the malaria, however, coming from the horrid food and water situation. 12 soldiers died in August, the next month it was 24, while 250 were hospitalized, and by mid-September, a third of the force was too sick to fight. Being a specialist in the Pacific War, I do have to say, what amazing parallels this will play out for the Japanese and Americans in island-hopping warfare. Yes, it's not fun to battle the elements, malaria, and terrible provision situations. Then there was a horrible incident when a commercial ship called the Kite ran aground on a sandbank on September the 15th. The captain, named John Nobles, lost his 5-month-old baby. He, his wife, and 26 crew members clinging to the boat's wreckage were all eventually captured by a Chinese war junk. All of them were put in chains and imprisoned at Ningbo. They were then placed in a wooden cage, and the wife of John Nobles stated, "Mine was scarcely a yard high, a little more than 3/4 of a yard long, and a little more than half a yard broad. The door opened from the top. Into these were lifted the chain around our necks, being locked to the cover. They put a long piece of bamboo through the middle. A man took either end, and in this manner we were jolted from city to city to suffer the insults of the rabble, the cries from whoever were awful." Some of the captured crew were beaten to death. 3 men died of dysentery, and those who were Indian amongst them were treated extra harshly. One of the English prisoners believed the Chinese treated the Indians worse because they ate rice with their fingers, which apparently really angered the Chinese. When Charles Elliott heard the news of the captives from the Kite, he was mortified, particularly because one of the prisoners was a woman. He went to Ningbo aboard the Atalanta to negotiate their release, and he was immediately told all the prisoners could go if the British gave back Chusan. The British did not say no, but did nothing to indicate they would hand over Chusan. So the Chinese began to threaten to kill the prisoners. This prompted Charles Elliott to demand a meeting with Tisan at Dinghai, only 10 miles away from the prison at Ningbo. Elliott stated to Tisan if the prisoners were not handed over, he would end the peace talks outright. Tisan played some hardball, demanding Chusan be returned, but eventually a compromise was made. Elliott agreed to stop British ships from seizing Chinese vessels and the blockading of the ports, and in return the Chinese would still hold the prisoners, but they would improve their living conditions. To show good faith, Tisan released poor old Stanton from his prison in Canton and handed him straight over to Elliott. The situation did not satisfy the British, but while they danced around with diplomacy, more and more troops from India were being brought to Chusan. And the most fearsome weapon Britain had at its disposal had just arrived: the Nemesis. I would like to take this time to remind all of you this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. So please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast, the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. If you'd like to see visuals, I have a 45-minute episode on the First Opium War, and on the Second Opium War, and a historic film review of 1997's The Opium War. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. Lin Zexu's efforts against opium were not going well enough, and he was losing favor with Emperor Dagu. The British were winning battles and taking territory. How will the Qing Dynasty rid themselves of the foreign invaders? Join us next time to find out.